This video is made possible by Skillshare. The first 500 people to click the link below will get a 2-month free trial of Skillshare. Snakes on a Plane was a ridiculous work of fantasy with no basis in reality. But as it turns out, a scenario almost exactly like that once happened over 100 years ago, but on a boat. While some of the details of the event have been lost to history, what we know for sure is that sometime in the closing months of 1889, a ship called the Margaret set sail from the city of Durban in current-day South Africa, helmed by one Captain Sargent. The Margaret was headed for Boston with a rather curious cargo that included at least 100 cockatoos, a dozen or so snakes, 2 crocodiles, an orangutan, a gorilla, and an unconfirmed number of monkeys and parrots. According to a copy of the Sydney Morning Herald from April the 9th, 1890, the animals were destined for a museum, though it doesn't mention which one. Shortly after setting sail, a horde of rats caused chaos by eating through the meager grain stores that had been set aside for the cockatoos and parrots, resulting in the deaths of all but a few of the birds by the end of the journey. The crew's efforts to save the birds were put on hold when a freak gale knocked over some boxes, freeing all of the snakes. At the same time, the crocodiles also managed to escape and entered into a 3-way battle royale with the snakes and the rats. Apparently, this made it so that the crew did not have safe access to a large portion of the ships for a reported 5 days. In a bizarre stroke of good fortune, after all of the snakes and rats were dead, the lone surviving crocodile was killed when a second storm hit and knocked over a box of cargo, crushing the crocodile and once again making the hold accessible. But this was not the end of it. You see, all of the monkeys had escaped and had taken refuge on the only place they felt somewhat safe, the ship's rigging. Despite the best efforts of the exhausted crew, they only managed to recapture about 4 of the monkeys before a combination of storms, high winds, and giant waves swept the remainder out to sea, never to be seen again. So at this point you might be thinking, well, this got to be the end of the video, right? Surely it's all over. But oh no, because at the beginning of the video we mentioned something about a gorilla. Yep, along with having a dozen snakes, 2 crocodiles, and a slew of monkeys to deal with on a relatively small ship, the crew also had to figure out how to convince an angry gorilla to climb back into the box that it had forced its way out of. As if that wasn't bad enough, the gorilla also somehow managed to get hold of a sturdy iron bar, which the Wiltshire Gazette reported. With this formidable truncheon, the gorilla threatened to brain every sailor who came within range. The only positive thing going for the crew was that the gorilla was still chained to the floor, though the chain did give it relatively liberal range. It reportedly put up an impressive amount of resistance, injuring almost every member of the crew as they vainly tried to get it back in its container. The worst injury was suffered by the crew's cook, who was apparently partially scalped by a crushing blow to the temple that he failed to duck. The gorilla then grabbed the cook, whose life was only saved by another crew member taking the opportunity of the gorilla being occupied to sneak up behind it and whack it over the head with the blunt end of a hatchet. The stunned gorilla was then forced back into its box. You might be wondering at this point what happened to the orangutan that was stored on board as well. Well, none of the news reports or accounts mentioned that it survived the trip, so presumably it either died the same way the monkeys did, or maybe it was eaten by a crocodile. We just don't know. In January of 1890, the Margaret limped into port in Boston, reportedly a great surprise to the museum staff, who simply assumed that the boat had been destroyed by a storm since it was so late to arrive. In the end, the staff who'd been waiting for their large shipment of animal cargo to arrive found only 4 cockatoos, a few monkeys, and a single gorilla. When the bemused authorities asked Captain Sargent what had happened, he simply responded that between the storms and the animals it was an experience he'd rather not repeat, and he promptly refused to talk about it. Thankfully for those of us who like a bit of odd and obscure history, his crew were significantly less tight-lipped and told the story to anyone who'd listen, leaving us of the 21st century with the humorous 19th century newspaper accounts of the event. So I really hope you enjoyed that video, and if you've ever thought that maybe the life of a 19th century sailor could be for you, then let me recommend a course on Skillshare, Becoming a 19th Century Sailor. It goes into a whole lot of details. It doesn't. There's not that course on Skillshare. If you really believe me up until this point, bad news. But the good news is that Skillshare do cover a whole lot else, stuff that you know would actually be useful. For me, I'm always mentioning the video courses. When I first got on Skillshare, there were loads. There are even more now. They have been expanded enormously. And what I like about Skillshare is they're not charging you for a particular course. If you like learning, like many of us do, it can get rather pricey if each course has a set fee. With premium membership with Skillshare, you can dive into any course you want and start improving your skills and doing more more of what you love doing. There's no buying individual courses just to watch one part of it, and no limits on what you can watch and learn. Really, the best way to see the depth on Skillshare is to just try it, and that's easier than ever with the 2-month free trial that you can get by clicking the link in the description below. That gives a 2-month free trial to the first 500 people, and it also helps support this show, so that's also a plus. So thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching.